Hello students, welcome back to Social Studies class. Today we are going to start chapter 6, World after 1945. Yes students, in our first 5 chapters we have studied in Social Studies book that our chapter first was talking about the world and India, where we saw the rise of British rule in India. And in the second and third chapter, we studied about the First World War, Second World War, its effect, what were the factors that led to First and Second World War. So, as we go to begin the chapter 6, you know very well that before 1945, there were 2 world wars and a lot of destruction had taken place. Thereafter, our world leaders had come together and have decided to end the war. But what can be done for this? And so we know that they had formed the League of Nations, which was a failure. And after that, they came together and formed the United Nations. The League of Nations was formed. And so, thereafter, we have been living peacefully. Not that there is no war at all, but somehow, till now, we are having peace. And so let's see what happens after 1945. Please be with me. The pages of history are full of innumerable wars fought in ancient India and the world. Yet, the most destructive war, which will always be remembered in the modern world, is the First and the Second World War. So students, it's not that in the history we had not fought. There had been fight, there had been wars, but nothing like the First and the Second World War, which will be always remembered in the modern history or in the modern world. And which are these wars, students? The First and the Second World War. The League of Nations was formed with the purpose of establishing permanent peace in the world. Make a bracket, students. The League of Nations was formed with the purpose. What was the purpose? We have already studied in the second chapter. The purpose was to establish permanent peace in the world. In the world is more important, students. I want you to underline that, because the main aim of the League of Nations was to establish permanent peace. But due to certain limitations, it failed, and in 1939, World War II broke out. So, in the beginning also I said that the League of Nations was formed, but student, it hasn't been 100% success. It also failed. It also had some limitations, and so the World War II took place in 1939. The disturbed state of mind and the horror of World War II persuaded human beings to once again make efforts for peace and protection of independence. This resulted in the establishment of United Nations, and that was when was the United Nations formed? On 14th October 1945. We have already studied that also, when the United Nations was formed. But students, once again, as we are seeing what was done. So, the establishment of United Nations was forming on 24th October 1945. It was formed in 1945. Now, so let's see. Now, the United Nations Charter, what was it? What was it saying about? So, the United Nations Charter starts with the preamble, and it explains the goals of United Nations. Below given are the goals. So, United Nations Charter starts with the preamble. You know the students, in the chapter 8 also, we studied about the preamble to the Constitution. So, United Nations Charter also begins with the preamble. And what is that? And it explains the goals of the United Nations. What are the goals? And below are the goals of the United Nations. First, there is a determination to save the future generation from the pangs of all destructive war. Here, Emphasis has been laid on responsibilities born out of international laws and mutual understanding. Students, remember what is the first one? What is the first goal? There is a determination to save the future generation from the pangs of all destructive war. The future generation, the next generation should not have these wars, what has happened in the previously, that is 1939 to 45. We also know from 1914 to 1918, 1919 onwards, the First World War One. And so students, to avoid this all, to avoid the future generation from the pangs of destructive war, it should not be repeated in the history. These nations was formed, United Nations was formed. And so here emphasis has been laid on the responsibilities born out of the international laws and mutual understanding. It is not that the one or two nations have come together and have decided, but all the countries came together and they decided. It is internationally, the laws have been framed internationally, and also the mutual understanding. And what is the mutual understanding? You think about having war? No, saying no to war and saving the future generation. So this is the first point. The second point, emphasis has been laid on developing tolerance mutually so that the whole world develops socially. So what is that? Developing tolerance mutually. To bear with one another mutually. Just not because the one country says, I'm going to wage a war, and second supports no. Have tolerance. Bear it one another. Don't try to show the power of your arms and ammunitions. And so that is how the whole world will develop socially. Have dialogue. Don't wage a war at once. The third point is economic, social and cultural problems should be solved with the intervention of United Nations, and human rights as well as basic freedom should be disseminated. So what, students? Economic and social and cultural problems should be solved with the intervention of United Nations and human rights. We studied in our chapter 8, chapter 9 about the human rights. Which is the day students celebrated as the Human Rights Day? 10th December is celebrated as the Human Rights Day. And so students, what? That economic and social cultural problems should be solved with the intervention. Take the support of the United Nations. Just don't start the war between two countries with a lot of anger. Sit peacefully. Try to solve it. And who will intervene, students? United Nations will intervene. And what? As well as the basic freedom should be disseminated irrespective of caste, language, gender and religion. Irrespective of caste, language, gender and religion. Bear off with one another, students. No matter which caste, which language, which gender and religion. Try to spread or have tolerance with one another. Then the last point is that lastly, appeal to all the nations for cooperation to achieve these objectives. The request has been made to all the nations to cooperate with one another. To what? For what? To cooperate to achieve these objectives. Which objectives, students? The objectives which we saw above. First and foremost is that to avoid the wars or to save the future generation from the pangs of destructive war, where the emphasis has been laid on the responsibilities, where the laws have been framed internationally by having a mutual understanding. Second is that have the tolerance so that the world can develop socially. And the third, as we saw, economic, social and cultural problems can be solved through the intervention of the United Nations, no matter which caste, language, gender or religion you are. Each person has his human right. And so students, lastly the appeal has been made that everyone should cooperate with the objectives given by the United Nations. So then what happens? Thus the United Nations Charter concluded that dismissal of war and constant urge for peace is the main objective of United Nations. So what was the main objective, students? Peace was the main objective. Have tolerance, constant urge for peace is the main objective. Underline that, students. So this question can be asked for 2 marks. Here the 4 points have been given and you begin writing from the United Nations. So you have to make the 6 points, students, for 2 marks. So that is about the United Nations Charter. Now come to the next point, and that is about the Cold War and reasons and the consequences. What is that, the Cold War? From 1945 to 1962, we are not having the war with the arms and ammunitions, but the war of words. That somewhere we are trying to have war verbally. So let's see what is it talking about. Though the World War II got over, it resulted into creation of America and Russia as superpowers, while taking the place of England and France. So students, what? Who has emerged as a superpower? Who's resulted into the creation of superpower? America and Russia, taking the place of England and France. Right now, we're not talking about England and France, but we are talking about, though the World War II has got over, but 2 superpowers, which are these? America and Russia. In war, England, France, Russia and America were together. But Russian administration policies created differences, and thus America and England separated. So initially, these all 4 powers were there. We know it. We have already studied, students. In war, England, France, Russia and America were together, but Russian administration policies created the difference. Due to some differences, America and England were separated. A strong competition between the 2 superpowers, that is America and Russia, to establish supremacy over the world emerged after the Second World War. So students, what? The power for what? To become the superpower, to become the strong nation. And so to establish the supremacy, to establish the power, which 2 countries have been emerged? America and Russia. 2 powers have emerged, and they are the superpowers are America and Russia. What are they trying to show? Their supremacy, their control, their power over the world after the Second World War. The power was centralized between 2 poles, and that is America and Russia. America and Russia, between the 2 poles. And so students, what happens? Therefore, this time period is considered as bipolar world order. In the exam, you could be asked a question for 1 mark. What do you understand by the bipolar world order? You will have to write about America and Russia trying to establish their supremacy over the world after the Second World War. But the power was centralized between 2 poles, and these poles are America and Russia. Therefore, this time period came to be known as or considered as the bipolar world order. Please make the bracket to what I read. Now, owing to extremely tense relation between 2 power blocks, this phase is known as Cold War phase. At various incidents, both the superpowers almost came into conflict with one another. So students, what happened? They were trying to establish their supremacy, and with that there was an extreme tense relationship between these 2 powers, 2 power blocks, and this phase is known as the Cold War phase. It can be asked in the exam for 1 mark question. What do you understand by Cold War phase? Where there is the question about the Cold War and the reasons and the consequences can be asked for 2 to 3 marks. But what do you understand by the Cold War phase is a 1 mark question. owing to extremely tense relationship between two polar blocks, that is America and Russia. That period, that phase is known as Cold War phase. At various incidents, both the superpowers almost came into conflict with one another. At different point, though it wasn't the third war, it was the Cold War phase, and they came into the power, maybe verbally, they had the conflict. There was a basic change in relations among the powerful nations of the world after the World War. There was, what students? There was a change in relations among the powerful nations. Which were the powerful nations? England, France, America, and Russia. They were the powerful nations. But then, what happens? By the time the World War II gets over, America and Russia are trying to show their supremacy over the world. And so that is how they had this type of tense relationship. So there was a basic change in relationship among whom? Powerful nations of the World War, America and the Soviet Union, Russia, who had once allied and fought against the Nazi Germany, and the fascist Italy emerged as the leaders of two rival power blocks and military power. Make a bracket. Once they were together and they had fought against whom, students? Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy. You remember? Its leaders, Hitler and Mussolini, having their symbols, their uniform. I suppose you remember the flag and the swastika, the flag that they had, and the swastika was the symbol of the Nazis. And so students, this America and Soviet Union, they had fought together, allied, they came together and fought against whom? Nazi Germany and the fascist Italy. But now they were not in good relations. They were the two rival power blocks and the military power. Now, thus the Cold War started between them. Started between whom, students? America and Russia, which is written over here, Soviet Union. Though Britain and France also had emerged victorious, yet they lost the status of great powers due to terrible ruination caused by the ravages of war and ending of the imperialism. So students, it's not that the Britain and France were not powerful, but they had lost their power due to the terrible ruination, the destruction that had taken place by the ravages of war, and that is how they also have ended the imperialism, control over the other countries. And so Germany, Italy and Japan not only lost the war but also were ruined economically, politically and militarily. So students, what happened? After this World War I and II, Germany, Italy and Japan, they had lost the war, they had lost themselves in the war, but also they were ruined, they were economically, politically and militarily shattered. They were getting destroyed, and so they could not emerge. They have lost that title of being the supreme over nations. After the World War, the Soviet Union, that is Russia, captured the eastern areas of Germany and other eastern countries like Austria, Albania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria and the Baltic states. Make a bracket, students. After the World War, what happened? Soviet Union, that is Russia, had captured the eastern areas of Germany. And eastern countries like, underline the countries, Austria, Albania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria and the Baltic states. Later on, they gave away reins of power to respective communist parties of those countries. Russia was a communist country, and so therefore they gave power over the parties, communist parties of that country. They did this to continue their superiority on these countries. So which countries, students? Countries like Austria, Albania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria and the Baltic states. So, during 1949, turn the page students, by conducting a nuclear test, the Soviet Union directly challenged the monopolistic nuclear powers of America. So what? Russia wanted to show to America, and so therefore they conducted the nuclear test. This way, the Soviet Union directly challenged the monopolistic nuclear power of America. Meanwhile, democratic system was gradually established in the Western European countries that were liberated by British and American forces. So what happened? Meanwhile, the democratic system was gradually established in the Western European countries, and that was liberated by British and American forces. So you see that now Soviet Union, that is Russia, the communist country, the power is in their hand. They are also trying to have that nuclear test directly on the by challenging America, who was having the monopolistic or monopoly over the nuclear power. So over here we studied about United Nations Charter and the Cold War. Students, tomorrow in the next class we'll study about the world distributed among the army group. I'm going to stop over here. Please read the lesson. Have a good day.